Hello and welcome to the Pacifica Experience Day. My name is Jessica Rubenstein and I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. We will first be given a welcome by Dr. Joseph Campbell, the President and CEO of Pacifica, followed by Peter Roysevich, Provost. Let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to President and CEO, Dr. Joseph Campbell.
Welcome, everyone. Really great to have you here as we go through this historic time. This last year in our country has been one that's unprecedented. And so the question is, what is education now and where is it going in the future? That's really part of the deep question that I think I want you to reflect on as you say, why Pacifica now? Is this the place for me? Is this where my calling is? And let's look at Pacifica a bit. It's in the history of the depth psychology traditions, including mythology. Now, that's been going on for more than 100 years, and it's undergone an enormous amount of change. Originally, the notion of the unconscious, and that's what we're going to use as a central point here. The unconscious was something that was seen as within ourselves, something that operated in some tension and opposition to our conscious perspective. And that was a sea change at the time, a really radical idea. We began to learn more and more about that. It was where we were sort of not aware, and that it had an emotional quality to it. We began to understand that within us, in our emotions and in our bodies, we held unconscious components that sometimes were at odds with our waking life, and that the whole world of psychotherapy taught us to begin to release, to de-repress those contents, to begin to tolerate them in our minds, and with that, expand our views of ourselves and our relationships. Over time, that notion of the unconscious began to expand into the notion of the implicit, to bring that in as well. What's the implicit? Well, if you've ever ridden a bicycle or played a piano, the way you practice something so that it becomes so deeply ingrained in who you are that you don't think about it, you're able to just do it. And if you think about it, if you try to cognitively ride a bicycle, you'll fall over because your reactions would be slowed down so much by your cognition that it wouldn't give you the kind of stability you need. So it's a very helpful mechanism. However, when applied more broadly, we implicitly take things in that we sometimes build in kind of hard spots in our personality and in our relationship to the world. And so there's some unlearning that has to go on. And this is where a kind of critical inquiry is so crucial to our reflections. And that's been part of the antidote to just an Enlightenment education that has been in prevalence. Now, as we enter the 21st century, and particularly this year, we're seeing holistic challenges and really challenging us to rethink our notions of what the unconscious is, what education is, from a more holistic and systemic perspective. Think of, say, the pandemic, which this is constantly in the news. How are we going to work with that? What about the mutations that are forming? Will we be able to understand that in a deep way and get ahead of that, or will we be swamped by it? Well, to do that, we need a systemic perspective. That is one that looks at what would be invisible from the conscious perspective, because it's broader. And so understanding that and what preventative measures are is part of where is our unconscious resistance to that. That's part of what we're facing, to what we can't see. It's always been part of the notion of the unconscious is the invisible. And so climate change is a really important piece of it, because we know about weather, that's our daily experience. But climate change is something that's happening at a wider scope and at a broader, more global level. And it's much harder to know without tools of inquiry. And of course, now we are beginning to really learn that climate change and the pandemic themselves are deeply intertwined, because the animals that were in the more tropical areas, as the planet's heating up, are moving to different latitudes. They're interacting with other species, say migratory birds that had not formerly been an interaction, and so this becomes a chance for opportunistic infections. So we need a much larger view. We need to take into account that which we have not considered before. So this requires something more than even what we've learned about with the unconscious before. It's expanding our worldview, and to do that we have to take a deeper dive into our notions of learning and our experience of interconnectedness. And we know from depth psychology that this is where the mythic realm lies, that ultimately these stories are really crucial. And there's something about the nature of truth, the tension between belief and truth, which is we as a society are now wrestling with mightily, that have connections at the deep archetypal level in terms of the mythic qualities of this. And this brings us to things like altered states of consciousness, the other parts of ourselves that have the noetic ability, the knowing, not through the ordinary channels of consciousness, but others, and how that is going to inform the way we perceive the world, the way we understand ourselves in the world. Though it's a deep ecological vision that needs to be married to the previous depth psychological perspectives for a much more expanded one. And this will take on things like systemic racism as well, because the deep beliefs that are hidden in there that have all of these implicit snarls and hard spots need to be dissolved, not just in you, not just in me, but in our whole systems. And this is a challenge that Pacifica itself is positioning our staff, our faculty, and our students to really embrace these challenges. And so with that, I heartily welcome you to join us, and I'll now turn over to my good colleague, our provost, Dr. Rosevich.
Good morning, Joe. And good morning to all of you. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Institutions in every sector of society today are undergoing internal self-reflection and appraisal of their mission, vision, and values. And Pacifica is no exception. Alarmed as we are by denials of potent realities that include a potentially deadly virus, climate change, institutional racism, and white supremacy, Pacifica is asking itself meta questions about how Pacifica learns and engenders learning, the basis of our knowledge, and whose values and group interests are embedded in and privileged by the celebrated depth psychological knowledge of our curriculum. And we are resolutely committed to critically interrogating our institutional biases and assumptions for the purpose of organizational transformation. And this commitment is of two kinds. It is a comprehensive commitment to Pacifica's health as a living whole system, because no one works, let alone thrives, in isolation. And also, in a second way, it is a commitment to an uncompromising thoughtfulness in all things. And this thoughtfulness should be understood not just as a pursuit of irrefutable logic, but should be understood as a refusal to live hypocritically. We try to forge a community that is based on incontestable honesty, where everyone can study and work and live as themselves freely and safely without intimidation. And so we can see this work being done at Pacifica at the level of our diversity, equity, and inclusion task force. We see the faculty group of 5 working with our Diversity and Inclusion Council to look at issues of diversity and inclusion in our curriculum and in our hiring of BIPOC faculty and the enrollment of students of color. As a premier category of 1 graduate institute that takes a depth psychological perspective, we are committed to inquiry and research and scholarship. And insofar as Pacifica makes a distinction between two types of scholarships, two types of scholars, I would like to point that out. First, we see that there is such thing called a false scholar. And a false scholar, from our point of view, is anyone who, while they add knowledge to our cultural storehouse, do not question the conventions or the values or the biases of their disciplines, nor do they question those biases within their own society. And their ugly argument for superiority, we see it hardening in the forms of nationalism, or hardens into borders, into racism, into holocausts, into colonializing, into the mistreatment of people in gender transition or people with disabilities. On the other hand, we recognize true scholars. And the true scholar is someone who learns something positive and also something condemning about themselves through their careful scholarship and their research considerations of the lives of others. The pro-humanity call of the true scholar inspires us. It inspires many of us to be intellectual outlaws whose scholarship dares to raise questions about the reductive and dehumanizing models of privilege. True scholars take up the cause of humanity and point out the pressure points in the culture where human beings are regulated to too small an area of expression or participation in the body politic. So during this time of radical polarization of parties, of people, even of species, the work of the true scholar is essential to our national well-being. And so if your calling is to be a true scholar that is a provocateur raising questions about the world we live in, I invite you to join the community. And on behalf of the graduate faculty at Pacifica, please do consider joining us in our project to tend to the diverse and rich nature of soul in and of the world. Thank you for your attention, and I do hope that you'll consider joining us at Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Thank you so much for the welcome. As an overview of the day, we will have a featured presentation followed by 2 program breakout sessions. So if you're interested in 2 programs, you can attend 2 different ones if you like. And finally, we'll close the day with a student services panel with various departments from Pacifica Graduate Institute. There is a free application link on the landing page. So please use that link to apply to Pacifica for free by the end of the weekend. The free link will be open until Sunday evening. And if for some reason you do miss that opening, you can email us at admissions@pacifica.edu. On the landing page, we do also have information about our admissions advisors. So please feel free to contact them with any questions after this day, or you can also reach out to admissions@pacifica.edu with any general questions. Next, I'd like to introduce our featured presenter, Dr. Saffron Rossi. She will be presenting on Joseph Campbell, Myth and Psyche. The presentation will go until about 11 o'clock or 5 after 11, and then we'll begin taking Q&A. So if you have any questions for our presenter, you can begin to type questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll be fielding the questions to Dr. Rossi. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Saffron Rossi.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for that. Greetings, everyone. I'm Saffron Rossi. I'm one of the core faculty in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program, which is one of the specializations in the depth programs at Pacifica. And it's a pleasure to share with you today some ideas about the work of the great mythologist Joseph Campbell, who was quite literally a godfather of Pacifica, having not only directly and personally inspired the founders of the school, as well as the faculty who designed some of the original master's Ph.D. programs, but he also gave weekend seminars on the Ladera Lane campus, which is the larger of the two of our campuses. And after his death, his personal library was also entrusted to us, and that's housed on the smaller of our campuses, Lambert. So, this morning, and I'll also say that for a number of years, I was the curator of his manuscript and archives collection. So he's a very important person for me as well. So, so what I want to do this morning is talk about Campbell's discussion of C.G. Jung's ideas regarding the relationship between myth and psyche. And this has to do with the power of mythic metaphors and their role in living a meaningful life. And because you're here today, because you're curious about possibly coming to Pacifica, I also want to touch on the theme of the mythic nature of calling and what Campbell's work and insights on the archetypal journey of the hero has to offer in that regard. So if you happen to be new to this discussion about mythology and its relationship to depth psychology, a way to think about it is that most of the programs at Pacifica have a primary orientation to Jungian depth psychology. And the distinguishing feature of this psychology concerns our understanding of archetypal patterns and their relationship to psychological life. And myths give us arguably the most direct insight into those archetypal patterns. Now, of course, each program relates to this mythic archetypal connection in different ways and to different degrees. But at least what I'm going to share with you will give you a flavor of the kind of approach to the theme that we engage here. So I want to start with my favorite and simplest definition about what the value of myth is to psychological life. So a group of young kids in primary school are starting to read myths from around the world. And the teacher asks them, what is a myth? And a young girl raises her hand and she says, a myth is a story that's not true on the outside, but true on the inside. That to me is like a genius definition. Myths are true on the inside and false on the outside. Well, how we can listen to that from a psychological frame is to say, myths are not literally true, but metaphorically meaningful. Now, this raises a question, this inside-outside. What is inner truth? Now, for Joseph Campbell, the inner truth is the spiritual reference of the symbolic forms of myth, and that these symbols come from the psyche and they speak from and to the spirit. And for Campbell, he understood the symbols of myth, whether culturally shared or personally held, to be the vehicles of communication between the deepest depths of one's spiritual life and consciousness. So I'm going to unpack a lot of that, over the next 40 minutes, but I wanted to just sort of begin with this. So a few biographical details on Campbell. So he was born in 1904 and he died in 1987. His very well-known The Power of Myth series, which many of you may be familiar with, was actually released after he had died because it came out, I think, at the very end of 87 or 88. So his sort of cultural impact was posthumous, which is obviously the case for a lot of great thinkers. Campbell had an early interest in Native American Indian mythology. And his master's thesis was on medieval literature and Arthurian legends at Columbia University in New York City. After he finished his master's degree, he continued his studies in Europe, particularly in Munich and Paris, and then the Great Depression hit. And it apparently hit about 3 weeks after his return back to the East Coast from Europe. And so he was unemployed for roughly 5 years. He couldn't get a job. And so he and his sister rented a cottage in Woodstock, New York. And there he began reading Dante, Joyce, Homer, Lao Tzu, basically, in sort of the words of Campbell, like finding his bliss. And then once sort of the job market opened up again, he became a professor at Sarah Lawrence College, which at the time was an all-women's school, which he taught there for 38 years. His wife, Jean Erdman Campbell, was a famous dancer and choreographer who had her own theater company in New York City called the Theater of the Open Eye. Campbell's first published work was the commentary on the Navajo war ceremonial called Where the Two Came to the Father, which had been based on a series of conversations and notes that a woman named Maud Oakes took in discussion with a Navajo elder named Jeff King. And that was her research was combined then with Campbell's commentary, and together this was published by the Bollingen Foundation. And I think it's very interesting to just note that Campbell was recommended for the job by Heinrich Zimmer, who is an Indologist and a colleague of Jung's, who was also the link for Campbell into the field of psychology and its work with the humanities. And Campbell had spent 12 years working on Zimmer's posthumous works, these gorgeous volumes on Indian art and mythology. And then following that long sort of effort to bring his beloved mentor and teacher's work out into the world, Campbell came to publish his own first book, which was The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which no doubt many of you are familiar with. And that was published in 1949. So tiny little sort of biographical sketch there. But I mean, we can say that Campbell is one of the preeminent scholars on comparative mythology in the 20th century. And in a nutshell, Campbell was concerned about mythology's value, its function in human life. Now, of course, he was interested in the traditions of the past, the historical level, but the emphasis for him was on the importance of how myths and a mythic sensibility helps us be in relationship to the world and ourselves in a full way. Now, obviously, this has everything to do with the influence that Jung had on Campbell's thinking. But Campbell was also, wedded to the literary traditions, the religious and spiritual traditions that have always used stories to communicate the sort of purpose and value of life, right? So it's those two things, understanding the role of myth in a traditional culture, and then also understanding our contemporary recognition of the psychological orienting value of myth now. So, so the guiding idea of Campbell's work, we could say, is that the common themes in world myths are metaphors that reveal the constant requirement that the human psyche has to be centered in terms of deep principles, which are what are given with the archetypal patterns of the psyche. So I think it might also be helpful to talk about how what Campbell called the 4 functions of myth. And I think this is a useful frame to be exploring this topic in. Whole mythology is a complex organization of images and stories that are metaphorical of the possibilities of human experience and the fulfillment of a given culture at a given time. So, we could say perhaps even more directly, like myths are stories about things that have great meaning and significance in life. And there are various levels of meaning that myths fulfill. And this is what Campbell referred to as the 4 functions of myth. So I just want to walk through these kind of quickly. The first function of myth that Campbell talked about was the mystical. The mystical function of myth serves to awaken and maintain a sense of wonder in our waking consciousness of the whole mystery of what is a sort of ineffable sort of universe, right? The mystery of the universe. And he also would say that the mystical function of myth has to do with the discovery and recognition of the dimension of the mystery of being. I think this would be that part that has to do with how we reconcile to existence, like the wonders of birth, the suffering in life, death, what happens after death, all of those questions, these huge questions about the very nature of being, is what belongs to this mystical aspect of myth, and the stories, the philosophies, the spiritual traditions and images that sort of try to have us connect with that level of the human experience. The second is the cosmological. So the cosmological function of myth is that which provides a map or a picture of the universe and the world and our relationship to it, right? So it's our very notion of the structure of the cosmos and where we live within it. So there's that, but in a traditional sense, it also has to do with then that cosmological image being filled in every quarter with a measure of its mystical meaning. So in a traditional sense, the idea that the cosmos and the world is alive with a kind of meaningfulness or the presence of the numinous. Now, that isn't necessarily, but I kept saying traditional, because even if we don't have that more, that perspective, that more spiritual cosmological perspective, we still have a cosmological myth at work in us. For example, the Big Bang Theory and various kinds of new paradigm science theories about the nature of the universe that our planet is within. Those are cosmological stories about how the space around us and the earth came into being. So it can have a more materialistic or a more spiritual valences, obviously, but cosmologies have to do with the stories about the nature of our physical reality. The third function of myth is the sociological. And so that one has to do with the life customs of our culture, the moral systems that we all agree on as a community of people. You can think about the 10 Commandments in the Judeo-Christian tradition as serving the sociological function of myth, that there are certain things we do and we don't do as being a part of, a particular group or culture. And then lastly is the psychological. The psychological has to do with those stories and those rituals that aid the individual in her or his passage through life stages, from being a child to the responsibilities of adulthood, maturity, old age, and then of course, ultimately death, and then as an ancestor. So the psychological function of myth has to do with our relationship to the individual life journey. And it's in this function where we see myths as symbolizing important points in one's life, which have to do with the purpose of centering and harmonizing the individual to the larger their place both in the universe at large, but then also in relationship to the community. So that would be like initiation rituals, for example. So, and in that way as well, myths help with the kind of crisis of moving from one role into another, childhood to adulthood, being single to being married, right? I mean, all of it being, an individual, and all of a sudden being a mother, being an individual, being a father. I mean, all of these kind of crisis points of the transformation of who we know ourselves to be in our relationship to the world. Now, what's important, I want to say, is that, Campbell really understood that given our contemporary, more scientific worldview, at least, in the West, that the sociological function of myth and the cosmological functions of myth they function at different levels for us now. Those things keep changing. Our science keeps changing. Our social processes keep changing. So there's a newness and recognition of old sensibilities or paradigms that are being broken down. I mean, I think we're all very much aware of that in our contemporary situation. So those functions are always in process of change. That's kind of the nature of modern life. However, the basic psychological problems of a life, of our individual life, how we go, how we move through life in a kind of meaningful way, as well as the mystical problem of our sense of the greater meaning of our place, remain essentially unchanged. I mean, Campbell was really clear about that we still have to contend with the mystical and psychological levels of existence in a meaningful way, even though science and society keep changing. We have to be more fluid in responding to that and relating to that in a thoughtful way. So, I started with that little story about the young schoolgirl defining myth in that brilliant and simple way, that myths are true, are not literally true, but metaphorically meaningful. And I'm returning to this because, I do want to acknowledge that common definitions, when we think about myth right now, well, what comes up? A false story, a lie, a deception, or an illusion, the myth of the American dream. I mean, myth can even be defined and is used to define other people's religion, right? So that, I think, is very interesting. It helps us think about how there's a central ambivalence in the concept of myth, that it may mean something that's sacred or something that's obsolete or a falsehood. Now, it's important to recognize that in the modern era, what we have been faced with is a breakdown of traditional mythologies that have held the collective in various cultures and nations from time immemorial. Now, at least in the West, the breakdown of traditional mythologies, i.e., people no longer feeling that the church or their whatever religious group they were raised in and their family came from, no longer held them. It no longer made sense. They couldn't square it to science. They couldn't square it to their own beliefs, whatever that may be. But that breakdown in the collective level has led in the modern era to the energies that mythology gives image to, that religion gives image to be recognized within. And Campbell says, and this is from the beginning of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Freud, Jung, and their followers have demonstrated irrefutably that the logic, the heroes, and the deeds of myth survive into modern times. In the absence of an effective general mythology, each of us has his private, unrecognized, rudimentary, yet secretly potent pantheon of dreams. And so to take this straight from Jung, Jung says, all ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only in an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. So that really comes to the way that Jung looked at myth as dealing with myths as descriptive and evocative of inner processes and belonging to the unconscious realm and revealing the archetypal patterns of the unconscious. So in that sense, we could say that myths reveal the unconscious and help link inner and outer worlds. And myths not only show us the processes of the unconscious, but they also help reconnect us to it when we engage in mythic material. It's like engaging in mythic material sort of opens the door and allows for an encounter with the unconscious, an opening to its wonder. And, you know, I mean, to maybe put it even more simply, or sort of, I'm trying to sum up some of these ideas. Myths are archetypal patterns in human consciousness, and archetypal powers are mythical persons. We could say that the myths are the gods at work in our lives, right? So this is the very like center of depth psychology in terms of its relationship to myth, that myths are the gods at work in our lives. And so I think it's clear, if you're just holding that, myths are the gods at work in our lives, holding that and thinking about those 4 functions of myth that I just described from Campbell, I think it's clear that we can, recognize how central a need for myth, stories of meaning, really are, both individually and collectively. I mean, because the culture has a hunger for myth, we can either respond to that hunger in a conscious or unconscious way. And I think we have lately seen the result of people responding to that hunger in unconscious ways. I mean, including belief in conspiracy theories, behind which is a search for a cohesive story, right? Or behind which one feels that there's a secret, and that we have special insight or insight knowledge, right? Inside knowledge to it. So, it's really, this is pointing to the hunger that there's there for being connected to, informed by, and informing a larger story that has meaning of some kind. And if you're following me here, the whole point is that understanding myths gives us a window into the patterns of psychological life. But in terms of what's going on in the world, you can say in a more direct way that myths help us think about our thinking. And sometimes myths that are not more conscious can be dangerous. So like, sort of having laid some of that stuff out, I do also want to, say that the principal method of mythology is poetic, and it speaks in metaphors and analogies. I mean, metaphor is a Greek word, and it means it's a combination of 2 words, to carry over. So to carry over, metaphors are like images that are bridges that allow one image to be carried over to become another. And, sort of sister to metaphors are analogies that are showing a shared likeness or an inner concordance when we say this is like this. So mythology is all about a sort of metaphorical, analogous way of thinking. And metaphorical knowledge transcends rational knowledge. It goes straight into the body. It resonates with the psyche in a different way. I mean, it's the language of poetry, song, and dream. So just to draw this out for a moment, I just want to share the opening stanzas of Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise, because of the way the poetic images are drawn out, and we can hear that analogous poetic movement that she's invoking through her language. She writes, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room." That movement between like her being and these images of the energy that lives within her footsteps, the oil wells pumping in her living room, right? This is poetic feeling that moves us, that touches us. So these metaphors and the symbols too that belong to myth give a sense of the essence and value of something, right? It's as if symbols are energized by metaphors. And symbols convey not only an idea, but something of the realization of it, which I think is, of course, so much the power behind poetry. So an example of that would be the symbol of the virgin birth. I mean, this doesn't just live within the Christian tradition. There are much older myths that have virgin birth figures. For example, in the Egyptian tradition, Isis and Osiris. The virgin birth as a symbol has to do with the possibility of bringing forth something new and full of potential out of ourselves. It's a paradoxical image, right? To be a virgin means to be untouched. Psychologically, it has to do with the integrity of one's essential beingness. And yet there's a creative power that emerges out of that. So the virgin birth has something to do with one's sort of integrity and creative power that emerges out of the wholeness of one's being. And that's also touched with something kind of spiritual or numinous. This is not a biological possibility, but a psychological one, right? So symbols move us into trying to give expression to something that's kind of unknowable and indefinable in a concrete fixed term. And then so in order to express the idea, there's a likeness that needs to be drawn out, right? So, and I think a point that I want to make, and in terms of talking about metaphors and symbols, and going back to this whole thing about myths not being true on the outside but metaphorically meaningful, is that contrary to common misunderstandings, myths are not lies but metaphors. And this is something that Campbell wrote a lot about, which is that a lot of our trouble in our current time is how literal we have become, the kind of prosaic interpretation to read myths as historical occurrences and tangible facts. And the problem with that, and Campbell would often look to that strong thread of sort of historical, concrete interpretation that happens in both the Christian and Islamic religions, as well as our Western rationalistic worldview, is that when we emphasize the literal occurrence, that leaves us really only looking at the ethnic, idiosyncratic, and historical inflection of the metaphor rather than its spiritual archetypal core. So just putting those pieces there. So I think, now I'm sort of trying to build us up into taking a look at this idea of the kind of mythic imagination, and what does that serve? How does that relate to us today? We could think of myth as as a mythology, as an ecology of images that give a sense of participation in a field of meaning. That myths arise in a place where we attempt to explain how things are or how they came to be in a story-like way, filled with persons and interactions. A story in which all causes are understood to be intentions, wills, actions of purpose and effect. And in that way, Campbell really felt that because of that power that lives within these great stories of meaning, myths have the power to engender new myths, to activate myth making, to engage us in what Campbell called creative mythology, which is the conscious reshaping, revivifying of old myths, which then gives them the power to provide direction, depth, and meaning to our lives, and to also provide a sense of social continuity that expresses and facilitates change, right? So we're talking about both the personal and more social collective level here. Now, Campbell says that it has always been the prime function of mythology and ritual to supply the symbols that move the human spirit forward. Now, this is as much the case now as it was for any traditional culture that had a living mythology. But where in the past myths were these more explicit outer kind of practices, the stories and the rituals, in-depth psychology, myths are recognized to be at work in the psyche. And I think this is really captured in a really pithy phrase of Campbell's, where he said, myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths. So, this work of seeing the timeless metaphors of the great stories in our lives are really, it's about understanding the metaphors of our own struggles and yearnings and needs in life. And in that kind of engagement, we're becoming more conscious of who we are and what we have to do or fulfill in our life. Now, it was Jung in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, who gives us what is widely regarded as the beginning of the personal myth question. There's this whole sort of inner dialogue he has with himself, where like one voice in him says, in what myth does man live nowadays? In the Christian myth, the answer might be, do you live in it? He asks himself. And to be honest, he goes on to say, the answer was no. For me, it was not what I live by. This voice then says, then do we no longer have any myth? No, evidently we no longer have any myth. But then what is your myth? The myth in which you do live. And Jung then says, at this point, the dialogue with myself became uncomfortable and I stopped thinking. So I bring this in because this whole question of in what myth do you live, this whole question of what is the sort of guiding energy or narrative of your life, this the sense of connection we have to our individual unfolding is what Jung meant by the myth which we are living. And that, I think, is intimately tied to our sense of calling. Now, calling, and it's very nice that both, Job and Peter both touched on that in their introductions this morning. Calling has to do, it's a feeling of destiny, right? It's a sense of what I must do, or this is who I am, or this is what I must have. The sense of personal calling is what James Hillman, one of the founders of archetypal psychology, said is something that is often lost in so many lives and needs to be recovered. Because to be connected to a sense of personal calling is what brings one out of a feeling of meaninglessness, because it gives us a sense of being alive. Now, this also what Hillman called a central mystery at the heart of each human life. That question of calling put in depth psychological terms would be, what does it mean to live in a conscious way in these times in our world today? I think those things are related. And for Campbell, it was the hero and the mythic heroine and hero who personified the need for living in accord with our calling, to live in a more conscious way in terms of what our own purpose is and how that meets up with the world in a way that vivifies both our individual life and the collective life in which we participate in. And that's because the hero's journey is an archetypal pattern with many, many different myths that describe it from many different cultures all around the globe, that depicts the transformation of consciousness. The hero's journey is really the story of how an individual becomes more aware of who they are, what their gifts are, what their purpose is, and where those things must be applied. So in that sense, the hero's journey helps us give form and shape to the plot of our lives and this quest of calling and our sense of destiny. I think, the really important piece here is that there's this archetypal plot that belongs to the hero's journey. This is why Campbell called it the monomyth, because it was the plot for every person. And that has two components. The first being one's individual spark or soul. This would be our consciousness. and then the way that we feel a kind of connection to a spiritual meaningfulness of life. That would be our purpose or calling, our service in life, and what we must do as an individual. Now, the great challenge of the hero, understood psychologically, is that the hero makes themselves open to what Campbell calls self-achieved submission. So what does that mean? That the hero must submit to the inner realm and endure the difficult thresholds of transformation that demand a change in one's patterns, not only of conscious, but also unconscious life. That's how Campbell defines it at the beginning of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So this is the crux of the hero's journey. The way in which our small self, which would be like our ego self, would submit to the larger self. So what is the small self? So some examples of it would be like our attachment to security, to the known, our childhood dependencies in life, or our kind of comforts, at the expense of our cultivation of our potentials, which necessitate risking failure, our deepening individuality, which necessitates separating from parental complexes, personal or collective, in order to know just who we are and what we have to offer, what our sense of purpose is, rather than only what it is that we have to do. You know, so for Campbell, you know, this connection to the hero's journey and that self-achieved submission of going on the journey where we sort of are seeking this larger sense of who we are. Finding and living one's myth for Campbell was a spiritual calling and heroic, because in that surrender or sacrifice or self-achieved submission has to do with really challenging how life, society, civilization clamps down on any movement away from collective values. And the hero's journey becomes one of discovering what our individual values are and living from that ground, you know, in a meaningful way to the collective. So in the spirit of that, and as a way to sort of bring this to a close, and I know that I've kind of put a lot of big ideas on the table, but it's, you know, hopefully these are sort of clicking and seeding connections for you as you're listening to this. I want to invoke a mythic image, and that's the image of the Grail quest. Very, very important to Campbell. You know, remember he wrote his master's thesis on Arthurian legends, and so this was very important mythic tradition for him. And there are a number of Grail quest stories. They're not all the same in the Arthurian tradition, but one of the main ones is that the world has become a wasteland, that nothing would grow. It's like there's no longer any green, trees won't blossom, fruits won't come to flower, and either Arthur or the Grail King have fallen ill. So this is the wasteland that the ruling, you know, sort of the ruling principle, the guiding kind of light symbolized by these king figures, as well as the land itself, the very source of nurturance and vitality are ill, they're wasted. And the Grail Knights are called to the quest to find the Grail, because it is in the finding of the Grail that there will be renewal of the spirit of the land and the capacity to heal the sick king. When the Arthurian knights go in search for the Grail, they have to go alone. This is one of the rules in the quest. And they have to enter the woods at the darkest point on their own and where there is no path. If we listen to this myth with a psychological ear, which is what Campbell always did, we can hear the question it poses to us. Are you to go on the creative soul's quest for what vivifies and renews the land of your soul, or will you pursue the life that only gives you security? In other words, are you on a Grail quest, or are you attached to the wasteland? So finding your life's passion, your call, and following that is to move beyond the wasteland, which one level of defining that would be the disenchantment of modern life. It's about the search for what matters. So in conclusion, I'd like to just read you a poem in full by the dancer and choreographer Martha Graham that's titled Night Paddle. And hopefully it sort of draws all of this together. And she writes, "There is a vitality, a life force, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and be lost, and the world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable it is, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep open and aware directly to the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open. No artist is ever pleased. There is no satisfaction whatever at any time. There is only a queer, divine satisfaction, a blessed unrest that keeps us marching and makes us more alive than the others." So in that vein, I think it's myths, and Campbell would agree, I believe, that it's myths that help us learn to identify the channels that need to be kept open in our individual lives as well as in our collective lives. So with that, I will stop, and I welcome any of your questions. And I think, Jessica, if you want to see if anyone's asked anything, I'm happy to do my best.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Rossi. So at this time, we will be taking some questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We won't have time for all of the questions, but Dr. Rossi will be leading the breakout session for the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. So if you have more questions in relation to that program, you can see her in the breakout session.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get started. The first question is, how do we discern whether a myth is simply a story or a myth with deeper meaning and power?
Well, from in-depth psychology, all the stories we tell are individual stories, as well as all of the stories that we've inherited, myths and legends and fairy tales, have depth. They are, whether they're the stories of our lives that we are working with and through in therapy, or they are these collectively inherited stories. Storytelling is itself a kind of deep, important function of the way we make meaning. So I don't know, maybe you're thinking of differentiations of another kind, but in-depth psychology, in this particular psychological art, all stories are communications attempting to give meaning and experience some kind of meaning in our life and in what's happening. I hope that made sense.
Another question, it appears there is a missing and important value in the need for myth to continue and be brought to the forefront. It's either missing from objective reasoning, technology, tradition. How does someone, a person, or largely in culture and society carry this out? Bringing myth back to the forefront.
Well, I think so that's an interesting thing from our perspective. The myths are alive and at work. Myths are, another way to put it, they would be our paradigms, our ways of thinking. But the trouble in our modern age is that we're unconscious of these patterns of thought or vision or value at work in us. So it's not, so I think from this perspective, the issue is, how do we become more conscious of the myths patterning our way of seeing, and thereby being more related to and conscious of the myths at work, you see. So that mythic sensibility has something to do about the very way that we're thinking. And so that, and that's really central to depth psychology, becoming conscious of what we're unconscious of, and what we're unconscious of is the mythic patterns at work in us. Traditional indigenous cultures tend to be much more aware of it because myth is incorporated in their sense of being. In our more rationalistic modern way, we've said, those aren't so important. Those are other people's religion. So, we've become more vulnerable to being driven by these stories without recognizing that they're happening and that they're unfolding.
Another question we have is, what about when someone is constantly in entertainment, watching TV, movies, playing video games, but it feels robotic or unconscious, that they're not even thinking about it? Is there some part of the myth that is seeping into their unconscious and satisfying their hunger for a cohesive story?
Yeah, wow, that's a really good question. And I think some of my colleagues who are psychologists could probably speak to that more. The psychological, what's going on there? Is it a numbing and a dissociation? Is it an escapism into another realm? I mean, I think that's a really big question. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's a good question. I think we can recognize, though, for all of us as we sit at night, Netflix or Amazon Prime, whatever we're doing, the hunger for story, the hunger for engrossing stories that kind of draw us out of ourselves. I mean, that's very powerful, right? And that can be both inspiring, and also it can serve to kind of keep us out of connection with our life. So, yeah.
Another question we have, I hear that mythology incorporates cultures from around the world. The symbolism you have used, such as the Virgin Mary, the Grail, they're Eurocentric, being that Jung and Joseph Campbell were historically drawn to a certain culture. How does the curriculum include other cultures and move away from the Eurocentric view to incorporate a holistic worldview?
Yeah, well, I think, I did actually, when I was talking about the virgin birth, I talked about how it's one of its more older images. Pre-Virgin Mary is actually Isis, so a goddess of the Egyptian culture. So, definitely participates in another stream. But I think that if you, as you begin to study Campbell, for example, his, watershed book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, it's not Eurocentric in its view. He writes at depth about the Buddha, right, and drawing on Eastern traditions. Any study of the archetypal patterns of life require a vast study of various different mythologies. Our work, so we can recognize that in the tradition. Marie-Louise von Franz, who is perhaps sort of, the most sort of celebrated or luminary colleague of Jung's. I mean, she was deeply immersed in Chinese mythology and religion, as well as Persian and Middle Eastern alchemy. I mean, there's an amazing Jungian and archetypal studies have dipped into the fields of many, many different cultures. And our work as students and contemporary individuals bringing this on, we have to continue that and continue the discussion and the study of cultures beyond the European. But the emphasis is on, seeing the connections, the archetypal patterns that connect people, and that how there are these sort of ethnic, idiosyncratic, particular cultural expressions of those archetypal patterns. And that's always been primary in the field. And so as you explore the literature, that I think that becomes really evident. But I know we also, Jung and Campbell, European descent men, I understand that sensitivity, but the field is remarkable when you start to kind of scratch below the surface in that sense.
Great, so let's take one more question here. Can you please expand more on the soul's creative journey where there is no path?
Well, so that idea about there not being a path, what Campbell is getting at in terms of the Grail quest, is that to go on this journey to kind of come into connection and hear or recognize what it is that is your calling, you can't walk a path that someone else has already walked. If it's your calling, like you've got to like walk into the woods, meaning you've got to follow your own nature, and not say, oh, well, my sister did this, or, oh, Joseph Campbell did that. I mean, these are always, we need our sort of inspirations and models that give us a sense of courage and capacity to discover what is ours. But at the end of the day, what is ours has to be an untrodden path that we must find. And so I think that, that's where, Jungian analysis comes in, where people go into analysis in order to begin to connect in a more direct way to the unconscious via their dreams, via their symptoms. And in that sense, become more related to the deeper mystery of their unfolding, and then therefore begin to follow that and to ask questions and to become more sort of emboldened to discover what that is. So that image of there not being a path simply means not following, in someone else's footsteps, but beginning to listen into and one's own desire, one's own longings. And even if that seems totally anathema or contrary to what our family values or what the culture's into, if it's yours and it's that thing that lights your fire, that's the whole sense of the renewal that the Grail brings, then one must be in search for that, to be connected to that. Yeah. But you can also listen to Campbell talk about this. I mean, he, this is sort of a really big thing, his whole thing about follow your bliss. So, so I really recommend, for those of you that are curious about this, to read his Hero with 1,000 Faces, or watch the Power of Myth series, where he's in dialogue with the late, great Bill Moyers. Yeah. Yeah, great.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Rossi, and for answering these questions as well. Again, Dr. Rossi will be leading the breakout sessions for the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program.